Next, from Springfield, John Bambenek, who earlier in the year proposed a constitutional amendment allowing for the recall of elected officials, tells us why he's against the recall amendment that voters will see on the November ballot. This runs about 10 minutes. John Bambenek, thank you for joining us on the Illinois channel, and we wanted to ask you a couple of questions regarding the recall amendment that will be on the fall ballot for voters. Now, earlier in the year, you were one of the proponents of the recall amendment, but as I understand it now, you are opposed to the legislation that is actually on the ballot. Tell us why you're opposed to the current legislation, and what is it that you had wanted when you were championing this issue earlier in the year?
Sure. The entire point of a recall amendment is to provide citizens a means of removing an office holder who no longer serves in the public interest. So it's an extraordinary measure for an extraordinary circumstance. Our former Governor Rod Blagojevich is a great example. The amendment that voters will vote on November 2nd requires, before any signatures are gathered, the voters can do anything, 30 legislators, 10 state reps from each party, 5 state senators from each party have to sign what's basically a permission slip before the voters can gather the almost 1 million signatures that are needed to get it on the ballot. Well, if you have this measure, recall that's supposed to let voters hold their politicians accountable, it makes no sense of letting those same politicians sign a permission slip to let you hold them accountable. More importantly, even if we had this, if this amendment were law under Rod Blagojevich, and Democrats are unanimous behind Rod, you'd be hard-pressed to even find 10 House Democrats who would have signed such a permission slip. If a recall wouldn't have been able to be used against Rod Blagojevich, it's pretty much a useless amendment, and that's what voters are going to be voting on. It's going to say recall, but the devil's in the details. It's going to be a recall that in no practical circumstance would the voters ever be able to use, no matter how bad a governor is.
Is it your contention, then, that those who are currently championing this amendment, to this version of the amendment, are using this as political hay, just to try to look as if they're for reform when in fact they're not?
Certainly some are. I think Governor Quinn has wanted recall his entire career. Jack Franks has wanted recall. And I believe they took this compromise simply to get something out there. I contend that compromise means it's pretty much a useless amendment. There are others who knew the voters wanted recall, but did not want the voters to ever be able to really use it. Now, this amendment is only going to be able to use against the governor, no other statewide official, not legislators or any other office holders. So even from that perspective, of the 18 states that currently have recall, we'd be the only one that limits it to the governor, and we'd be the only one that limits it by requiring that permission slip.
Who would you have it apply to if beyond the governor?
Anybody who's elected. Anybody who's voted on by the voters should be able to be fired by the voters.
And if they're recalled, what level of recall, how would the mechanism work in the legislation that you had proposed or that other states that you may be familiar with? How is it a simple majority to recall? Is it a supermajority? How does this work?
Most states, almost all of them, it's simple majority. 50% or slightly above 50% vote yes, then that politician is removed from office. In the case of Illinois' recall amendment, the lieutenant governor would immediately take charge of the state. Some states use that. Some states have a special election to immediately fill the position. For instance, when Gray Davis was recalled in California in 2003, there was 2 questions. One, should Gray Davis be removed from office? And then there was a list of candidates who you wanted to succeed him should he be removed. And that's how Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor of California. It's during that election.
You mentioned both Governor Quinn and Representative Jack Franks, who have been for recall. Were they for your version of the recall earlier in the year, do you know?
The version that was first proposed didn't have this permission slip requirement. I don't believe it even limited, it was any statewide official, and simply in the negotiations it got pruned down. I think if you asked both Jack Franks and Governor Quinn, they would generally hold to the populist position. If you're more or less, if you're voted on by the people, you should be able to be recalled by the people.
And why I'm asking is, is there not a legitimate argument that could be made that if you, and maybe this is the argument, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but some might say, you know, let's get this, and then we can improve it as compared to having no recall?
Well, if it were just a recall of the governor without that permission slip requirement, I could accept that because it's a step forward. A small step, but still a step forward. In this case, you're going to have recall on the ballot. People are going to say, yeah, I like that, vote yes for it. And years down the road, when they try to use it, they're going to realize it's useless. In the meantime, anytime someone brings it up, you've already got recall. Why are you talking about this? There will be no further opportunity to amend it, save an extraordinary set of circumstances. Amendments should be done right the first time. It's not legislation. They're very hard to enact. So it's not like the next session they're going to go and say, okay, let's re-amend the amendment that we already did. Likely, they're going to drop the subject.
What about the argument, on the other hand, if we had this recall amendment? It might be, I mean, under the scenario you laid out, it might well have been that you could not have had 10 senators sign off because of retribution that would have come from a Blagojevich administration. But what if you had someone who maybe suffered a stroke and refused to leave office? And you might want to just have some other circumstances where would it not at least help accomplish that? Let me offer to that one, and I'll have a follow-up.
The state constitution does actually provide a remedy if someone thinks the governor cannot exercise his office. You can file a motion with the Supreme Court directly, and they can judge the merits of that circumstance. It can be filed by anyone. Actually, when Rod Blagojevich was first arrested, both Lisa Madigan and myself with a couple of the citizens filed motions against Rod to remove him right then. The Supreme Court didn't entertain them, but there is a process to deal with that when there is a medical or mental incapacity to govern.
Now, on the other hand, then shouldn't we have a fairly high standard, because we don't want to have elections become meaningless to where people might point as an example, here we are in the land of Lincoln. Lincoln was very unpopular at points during the Civil War, but he knew he had 4 years to take the tough decisions and to be a leader. Would we not run the risk of undercutting someone who was going to be taking the tough but perhaps unpopular decisions and then find himself being voted out of office?
Sure. 18 states have had recall of governor and statewide officials for over a century. So this is not a new power in America. Mostly Western states have had it, California particularly. Only twice in history, in over a century, was there ever a successful petition drive to have a recall of a governor on the ballot. Once in 1921, the governor's name escapes me at the moment, but he was governor of Wyoming. He was impeached before the recall vote for corruption. And then Gray Davis, we mentioned, in 2003. Never in the history of this nation has a governor been subject to a recall election and won it, meaning stayed in office. Most of the time they fail unless the stakes are high enough, because of what you say. People don't want to simply just remove governors or politicians for unpopular decisions. The stakes have to be high. They were high with Gray Davis. They were high in 1921 in Wyoming, but we've never seen it happen because of special interests wanting some certain legislation that gets passed or any number of spurious reasons that are brought up. It hasn't happened in over a century, so it's safe to assume it's not going to happen in the future.
If the voters then fail to pass this, if they take your heed and vote it down, what would you do? What's the next step as far as getting the kind of legislation that you would back?
Oh, well, I think it's back to the drawing board for the General Assembly. They can say, okay, well, we're just not going to do a recall amendment then. Okay, and voters can hold them accountable as they see fit in the next election cycle, or can renegotiate another amendment to put on the 2012 ballot.
And again, the amendment process, this is an amendment to the Illinois Constitution. It has to go first through the Illinois legislature.
Correct. For this type of amendment, only the legislature can put it on a ballot. It has to be 3/5 vote in each chamber before it's listed on a ballot.
Would you therefore suggest that citizens who, when they consider legislative candidates, ask their legislative candidate, how they might, what position they would take on such a recall amendment?
Certainly. Many legislators who voted on this recall amendment are using this on the campaign trail. I'm giving you the ability to vote on this recall amendment. And certainly, if they're making it a campaign issue, then they should definitely be questioned on it.
You're not a household name, so some people may ask, who is this fellow John Bambenek? Tell us a little bit about your political activities and philosophically where you're coming from.
Let's say, I guess philosophically, I'm probably more of I'm obviously downstate conservative, but more populist oriented. I believe in recall. I believe in referenda initiative, term limits. I am a member of the Republican Party. I don't hold any political office. I am part of several political organizations, generally champion kind of reform causes. Probably like most voters, I believe the state of Illinois is not representing the great citizens of the state in a way it ought to. So I try to, take those causes up that'll hopefully move the state in the right direction.
Well, John Bambenek, you're an example at least of citizen involvement and the effect that individuals can have when they get involved. We appreciate you taking the time to discuss this issue with us.
All right, thank you for having me.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.